Picture this moment. A former attorney general goes on national television and publicly attacks a sitting member of Congress, not with policy critiques, not with legislative disagreements, with what many are calling thinly veiled threats. And then that Congresswoman walks onto the House floor and delivers one of the most powerful unscripted speeches of the year. No teleprompter, no prepared remarks, just raw truth. Jasmine Crockett versus Pam Bondi. A public defender turned lawmaker versus a former top prosecutor turned political operative. This isn't just another partisan clash. It's a defining moment about who gets to speak freely in America and who gets intimidated into silence. What you're about to witness goes beyond politics. It's about whether we still live in a country where intimidation is acceptable, where power protects some and prosecutes others, where the law applies equally or only to those without connections. Stay with me, because the next 20 minutes will show you why one woman's refusal to back down matters for all of us.
About what used to happen, what we need to be talking about is how we are going to legislate, because I think that some of my colleagues have confused what our jobs are, and I get that we're sitting in judiciary. And so it may seem as if we are here to be litigators, but we are here to be legislators, which means that we are supposed to be writing laws, not trying to have our own trials and determine whether or not something is true or not, or whatever the case is, or who should be sued, who shouldn't be sued. All I know is that a great American hero, a good senator out of New Jersey, said something to the effect yesterday as he was shattering the record for holding the floor, a record that had been held by another racist in this country. As he shattered that, he said something about the fact that this should not be about left versus right. It should be about right versus wrong. And I am going to tell you that I want us to focus on right versus wrong. The reason that we are struggling right now in this country as it relates to people not trusting agencies, honestly, a lot of it is because of elected leaders. Let me tell you, one of the things that the chairman and I actually agree upon, we don't agree on a lot, is that we both know that there has been a sharp incline as it relates to threats upon our lives. Regardless of what side of the aisle you sit on, we both know and agree that as sitting members of Congress, we both are enduring more death threats than anybody should in this country. And I believe that it is because of the divisive rhetoric, and it is because of the selective enforcement of things. And so when we have, and I'm gonna be clear, because I had remarks and I'm going a whole other way. To have the sitting attorney general go on, and I'm gonna call it faux news. I know some of y'all love it, but it's fake to me. To have her go on Fox News and to then decide that she wanted to send a threat to me, it was wrong. Because here it is, she is the highest law enforcement agent in this country, and people are watching and they are consuming this information, and they are believing that simply because I decided that I wanted to exercise my right to free speech, which I am not abridged from doing, that she then wanted to then politicize something that should not be politicized. I don't like Elon Musk. I'm gonna say it 50,000 times. I don't like him. I don't like that he going out there and he firing people. I think that he's a crook, because somehow the rest of us can't sit around and get whatever federal contracts we want. The rest of us can't sit around and get law enforcement and get them somehow ordained as federal law enforcement to protect him. The rest of us can't get our dealerships protected by the federal government. That is somebody that is operating above the law. For whatever reason, just because he has a lot of money, more money than everybody else. And yes, I am happy to see that on my birthday, which is what I said, there were peaceful protests around this world against him, because he is a problem. And so you never should have somebody that is sitting that high and is going to sit up here and threaten a sitting member of Congress when she knew good and well, if she watched the entire thing, that I specifically told protesters to make sure you consult with lawyers, just like I've told protesters over and over and over in the history of me advising people to go out and exercise their constitutional right. The fact that there are other sitting members that have received letters of threat from this new DOJ tells me that they are about retribution and they are not about following the law. The reason that our party, or I won't even say our party, our country is torn apart is because we can't even agree on right versus wrong. This should not be left versus right. The only thing that we're asking is that we have law enforcement that will show up when there is an actual crime. If somebody calls and says, hey, I need you to investigate this cyber crime, or I need you to investigate this child pornography, or I need you to investigate this robbery, then we want somebody to show up, and we don't want them to look at us and act as if just because I'm black or because I'm woman, that I am not worthy of having that case investigated, because we have an administration that is continuously railing against diversity, equity, and inclusion, or we don't need people that show up that feel like diversity should not be valued. That is why we should have somebody that may show up and looks like me. The final thing that I'll say, because you've been gracious, is this. When I first became a public defender, I had no criminal defense experience. And I walked in and I told my boss, Charlie, I said, listen, you should hire me. He said, why? I said, because I'm black. Charlie looked at me like I was crazy. And I said, let me tell you something. When I walk in, I'm going to walk in with a level of rapport and understanding that maybe some of my other colleagues will not. Charlie offered me my job, and I worked my butt off, and I worked really, really hard for all of my clients, not just those that look like me, and that is what it looks like to serve.
To understand what happened, we need to start with the attack. Pam Bondi, former Attorney General of Florida, former Trump impeachment defense lawyer, now a Fox News contributor with a platform reaching millions. She goes on air and uses that platform to call out Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett by name. Not in a congressional hearing, not in a legal filing, on cable television. The language is carefully chosen, but the message is clear. Crockett is accused of misconduct, of overstepping, of behavior that Bondi suggests warrants investigation. Here's what makes this explosive. Bondi isn't just a political commentator. She's a former top law enforcement official. When someone with that background publicly targets a lawmaker, it carries weight. It carries implications. And for many watching, it carried a threat. The subtext. If you speak too loudly, if you challenge power too directly, we'll come after you. Crockett got the message, and she refused to accept it. But before we get to her response, you need to know who Jasmine Crockett is. She isn't a career politician. She's a public defender turned state legislator turned congresswoman, someone who spent years defending people the system had already given up on, people without resources, people without power, people whose only hope was a lawyer willing to fight. That experience shaped her. In the courtroom, she learned that justice isn't automatic. It's fought for, and that the law, as written, only matters if it's applied fairly. When she ran for Congress, she brought that perspective with her, not as a slogan. As a lived reality, she represents Texas's 30th district, a diverse community that includes parts of Dallas, working families, immigrant communities, people who know firsthand what it's like when power is abused. So when Pam Bondi attacked her on national television, Crockett didn't see it as just political theater. She saw it as exactly the kind of intimidation she'd spent her career fighting, and she decided to fight back. The House floor, C-SPAN cameras rolling. Most members reading from prepared statements, carefully vetted by staff and lawyers. Jasmine Crockett stands up. No notes, no script. She begins calmly, almost conversationally. But there's steel underneath. She talks about what just happened. A former attorney general using a national platform to target a sitting member of Congress. Not for legislation she opposed. Not for votes she disagreed with. For speaking, Crockett makes it clear this isn't about hurt feelings. It's not about political rivalries. It's about a fundamental principle. In America, elected representatives are supposed to speak freely. It's literally written into the Constitution. Congressional immunity exists specifically to prevent this kind of intimidation. And yet, here we are. A former top law enforcement official publicly suggesting a congresswoman should be investigated for doing her job. Crockett's voice remains steady. But the message is unmistakable. This stops here. Then she says something that cuts through all the partisan noise. This isn't about left versus right. It's about right versus wrong. Think about that framing. In an era where everything gets sorted into red team versus blue team, Crockett refuses that framework. She's not saying Democrats are always right and Republicans are always wrong. She's saying there are principles that transcend party. Fairness, accountability, equal justice under law, those aren't partisan values. They're American values. But somewhere along the way, we've lost that distinction. Every issue becomes tribal. Every criticism gets filtered through political loyalty. And in that environment, actual wrongdoing gets excused as long as it's your side doing it. Crockett rejects that entirely. She's saying, I don't care what party you're from. If you abuse power, if you weaponize authority, if you use your position to intimidate and silence, that's wrong. Full stop. It's a simple message. But in today's climate, it's almost radical. Crockett then goes deeper into what she calls the weaponization of authority. She's not talking about abstract concepts. She's talking about a pattern, one we've seen accelerate in recent years. Law enforcement and prosecutorial power being used not to uphold justice, but to punish political opponents. Investigations launched, not because evidence demands it, but because someone with power wants someone else silenced. This isn't hypothetical. We've watched it happen. Prosecutors who investigate one party's crimes while ignoring identical behavior from their own allies. Federal agencies pressured to open or close cases based on political considerations. State attorneys general using their offices to advance partisan agendas. And now, according to Crockett, we're seeing the next evolution. Former officials going on television to publicly target sitting lawmakers. Not through official channels, not through legal processes, through media intimidation. The message to anyone thinking about challenging power: we see you. We know who you are. And we can make your life very difficult. Crockett's warning is clear. When law enforcement becomes a political weapon, everyone's rights are at risk. Today it's her. Tomorrow it could be anyone who speaks inconvenient truths. Then Crockett brings up someone unexpected. Elon Musk. Why Musk? Because to Crockett, he represents something larger. The way America has created a two-tiered system of accountability, she walks through the facts. Musk owns multiple companies that receive billions in government contracts. Tesla, SpaceX, Starlink, all deeply intertwined with federal funding and regulatory approval. He's been accused of labor violations, environmental violations, securities fraud. Yet consequences remain minimal. Fines that are rounding errors for someone worth hundreds of billions. Settlements that don't require admission of wrongdoing. Meanwhile, ordinary Americans face criminal charges for far less. A single parent who makes a mistake on a tax form faces prosecution. A small business owner who violates an obscure regulation gets shut down. A working person accused of a minor crime can't afford bail and sits in jail awaiting trial. Crockett's point isn't that Musk should be persecuted. It's that the law should apply equally. If you commit fraud, you face consequences. Regardless of your net worth. Regardless of how many government contracts you hold. Regardless of how politically connected you are, but that's not the reality. And Crockett argues that's exactly the problem. When people see the ultra-wealthy operate above the law while they get crushed by it, trust in the entire system collapses. This leads Crockett to a broader point about systemic inequality. Not just economic inequality, though that matters, but inequality in how justice is applied. She talks about her years as a public defender, the clients she represented, people charged with minor offenses who couldn't afford bail, who sat in jail for months before trial because they were poor, who took plea deals not because they were guilty, but because fighting the charges meant losing their job, their housing, their kids. That's one America, where the system grinds you down regardless of guilt or innocence, where having a public defender means you probably lose, where justice is something that happens to you, not for you, but there's another America, where wealthy defendants hire teams of lawyers who know every loophole, where corporations commit massive fraud and settle for pennies on the dollar, where political connections mean investigations quietly disappear. Crockett isn't exaggerating. This is documented reality. Studies show that wealthy defendants receive lighter sentences for identical crimes, that corporations settle regulatory violations without criminal charges, while individuals face prison. And that access to quality legal representation is the single biggest predictor of outcome. She's asking a simple question. Is that justice? Or is that just power protecting itself? Crockett then shares something personal, a story that illustrates why she does this work. She talks about becoming a public defender, about walking into courtrooms and seeing defendants who looked like her, black, brown, poor, and realizing that for many of them, she might be the first lawyer who actually listened, who actually cared, who actually fought. Representation matters, not as a buzzword, as a reality. When the legal system is dominated by people from one background, it develops blind spots, biases, assumptions about who deserves benefit of the doubt and who doesn't. Crockett saw that firsthand. Watched prosecutors assume guilt based on zip codes. Watched judges hand down harsher sentences to defendants they couldn't relate to. Watched juries convict people based on stereotypes rather than evidence. And she realized the system doesn't fix itself. It only changes when people who understand its flaws get into positions to change it. That's why she ran for office. Not for power. For change. To bring the perspective of the courtroom into the halls of Congress. To speak for people who usually don't have anyone speaking for them. And now someone like Pam Bondi wants to silence that voice. Wants to intimidate her back into submission. Wants to remind her that certain people aren't supposed to challenge power. Crockett's response: watch me. Crockett then addresses something most people don't realize: the surge in threats against members of Congress. This isn't partisan spin. It's documented by Capitol Police. Threats against lawmakers have increased dramatically in recent years. Death threats, stalking, harassment of family members. And it's not random. There's a pattern. Lawmakers who speak out against powerful interests face disproportionate targeting. Women of color in Congress receive the most violent threats. Members who challenge the status quo get doxxed, swatted, attacked online. Crockett argues this is no coincidence. When former law enforcement officials go on television and publicly attack sitting lawmakers, they're sending a signal. They're giving permission. They're telling their followers, this person is fair game. Most people won't act on that, but some will. And all it takes is one person who decides to take matters into their own hands. This is how democracies deteriorate. Not through coups, through the gradual normalization of intimidation, through making it dangerous to hold certain positions, through convincing people that violence against elected officials is understandable, even justified. Crockett refuses to accept that trajectory. She's saying clearly, you can threaten me, you can attack me on television, you can try to intimidate me into silence, but I took an oath, and I'm going to keep speaking. What happened next surprised even Crockett. The speech went viral, not in the usual political news cycle way, where clips get shared among partisans who already agree. It went genuinely viral, across platforms, across demographics, across political lines. Why? Because it wasn't performance. It was authentic. In an era of carefully focus grouped statements and poll-tested talking points, Crockett spoke from the heart. No script, no political calculation, just truth. People responded to that, not because everyone agreed with her politics, but because everyone recognized something real. The comments sections told the story. Conservatives who disagreed with her policies but respected her courage. Independents who were tired of seeing power abused regardless of party. Progressives who felt someone was finally saying what needed to be said. One comment summed it up. I don't agree with everything she stands for, but this is what leadership looks like. Someone willing to stand up and speak truth even when it's dangerous. That's the power of authenticity. In a political landscape dominated by carefully crafted personas, someone being genuinely themselves cuts through all the noise. But Crockett's speech also exposed something uncomfortable, a massive double standard in how we respond to misconduct. When someone on your political team abuses power, it gets rationalized. They were fighting the good fight. They were protecting us from worse. They made mistakes, but their heart was in the right place. When someone on the other team does the same thing, it's an outrage, a threat to democracy, proof of corruption, unforgivable. Crockett's point is, both are wrong, and we need to stop pretending otherwise. If you opposed the politicization of law enforcement under one administration, you should oppose it under all administrations. If you were outraged when one party weaponized agencies, you should be equally outraged when your party does it. Principles don't have party affiliations. Either we believe in equal justice under law or we don't. Either we believe in free speech and congressional immunity or we don't. Either we oppose intimidation of elected officials or we don't. You don't get to pick and choose based on political convenience. That's not principle. That's just tribalism. And Crockett is arguing that tribalism is destroying us. That as long as we excuse misconduct from our side while attacking it from theirs, nothing improves. The system just becomes more corrupt, more weaponized, more dangerous for everyone. This brings Crockett to her core message. Accountability must apply to everyone. No one is above the law. Not former attorneys general. Not billionaires. Not sitting members of Congress. No one. But accountability requires courage. From lawmakers willing to call out their own party when necessary. From voters willing to hold their own side accountable. From institutions willing to investigate misconduct regardless of political consequences. Crockett points to her own record. She's called out Democratic officials when they've fallen short. She's criticized policies from her own party that she believed were wrong. She's refused to toe the party line when principle demanded otherwise. That's what integrity looks like. Not blind loyalty. Not partisan warfare. Making decisions based on right and wrong, even when it costs you politically. And she's demanding that same standard from others. If Pam Bondi or anyone else believes Crockett has done something wrong, there are proper channels. File a complaint. Provide evidence. Use official mechanisms. But going on television to publicly attack a sitting lawmaker, that's not accountability. That's intimidation. And it cannot be normalized. Crockett's speech became more than just a response to Pam Bondi. It became a warning about where we're headed. Democracy doesn't collapse overnight. It erodes gradually, through the normalization of behavior that once would have been unthinkable. First, we accept political investigations into opponents. Then we accept threats against lawmakers. Then we accept violence as a political tool. Each step seems small at the time, but the trajectory is clear. Crockett is sounding the alarm. She's saying, look at what's happening. Former law enforcement officials publicly targeting elected representatives. Billionaires operating above the law. Threats against lawmakers becoming routine. Equal justice becoming a punchline. This isn't sustainable. Either we recommit to the principles that make democracy work, accountability, transparency, equal application of law, or we watch those principles disappear, and once they're gone, they're almost impossible to restore. Because power, once unaccountable, never voluntarily gives up that lack of accountability. The time to act isn't after democracy has collapsed. It's now. while we still have institutions that can be reformed, while we still have lawmakers willing to speak truth, while we still have a public that cares, Crockett's speech became more than just a response to Pam Bondi. It became a warning about where we're headed. Democracy doesn't collapse overnight. It erodes gradually, through the normalization of behavior that once would have been unthinkable. First, we accept political investigations into opponents. Then we accept threats against lawmakers. Then we accept violence as a political tool. Each step seems small at the time, but the trajectory is clear. Crockett is sounding the alarm. She's saying, look at what's happening. Former law enforcement officials publicly targeting elected representatives. Billionaires operating above the law. Threats against lawmakers becoming routine. Equal justice becoming a punchline. This isn't sustainable. Either we recommit to the principles that make democracy work, accountability, transparency, equal application of law, or we watch those principles disappear, and once they're gone, they're almost impossible to restore. Because power, once unaccountable, never voluntarily gives up that lack of accountability. The time to act isn't after democracy has collapsed. It's now. While we still have institutions that can be reformed, while we still have lawmakers willing to speak truth, while we still have a public that cares. So why does Jasmine Crockett's stand matter? Because every major shift in history started with individuals willing to refuse, to say no, to accept the cost of standing up. Rosa Parks refusing to give up her seat. Daniel Ellsberg releasing the Pentagon Papers. Whistleblowers risking everything to expose wrongdoing. None of them were perfect. None of them single-handedly changed everything. But each of them modeled what courage looks like. Crockett is doing the same thing, showing that you don't have to accept intimidation. That you can speak truth even when powerful people want you silent. That doing the right thing matters more than political survival. And she's reminding us of something crucial. Power respects strength, not submission. The only way to stop abuse is to confront it, to name it, to refuse to pretend it's normal. If every lawmaker responded to intimidation the way Crockett did, it would stop. Because intimidation only works when people comply, when they self-censor, when they decide speaking up isn't worth the cost. Crockett decided it is worth the cost. And in doing so, she made it easier for the next person to stand up. And the next, and the next. That's how change happens. Not through perfection, through example. But we should acknowledge something. Standing up comes with costs. Crockett knows she's now a bigger target, that more threats will come, that her every move will be scrutinized, that powerful people will look for opportunities to retaliate. She could have stayed quiet, could have let Bondi's attack pass without response, could have decided that speaking out wasn't worth the risk. She chose differently, not because she's fearless, but because she understands what's at stake. If intimidation works, it spreads. If lawmakers can be silenced through threats, democracy weakens. If speaking truth becomes too dangerous, truth disappears. So she spoke anyway, knowing the cost, accepting it, deciding that some things matter more than personal safety. That's not just courage, that's love of country. That's commitment to principle. That's the kind of leadership we need but rarely see. So what do we do with this moment? First, support courage when you see it, regardless of party. When lawmakers stand up to power, they need to know we're paying attention, that their stand matters, that they're not alone. Second, demand accountability across the board. Stop excusing misconduct because someone is on your team. Call it out every time, from everyone. Third, educate yourself. Learn about the issues Crockett raised. The two-tiered justice system, the weaponization of law enforcement, the intimidation of lawmakers. These aren't abstract concepts. They're documented realities. Fourth vote, not just for president, in every election. For lawmakers who will prioritize integrity over loyalty. For prosecutors who will apply the law equally. For officials who understand that their power comes with responsibility. And fifth, speak up. In your community, online, with friends and family. When you see injustice, name it. When you see double standards, call them out. When you see intimidation, refuse to accept it. Democracy isn't a spectator sport. It requires participation. And right now, it needs all of us. We're at a crossroads. The path we're on leads somewhere dark, where power operates without accountability, where speaking truth becomes dangerous, where justice depends on wealth and connections rather than facts and law. But it's not inevitable. We can choose differently. We can demand better. We can support the Jasmine Crocketts of the world who are willing to stand up. The question is, will we? Because silence is complicity. Looking away is acceptance. Deciding it's not your problem is a choice that has consequences. Crockett made her choice. She stood up. She spoke out. She refused to be intimidated. Now we have to make ours. Do we back her up? Do we demand accountability? Do we insist that principles matter more than party? Or do we let this moment pass? Accept that power can intimidate freely? Decide that it's someone else's problem? The choice is ours. But the window for choosing is closing. Jasmine Crockett didn't set out to become a viral sensation. She set out to do her job, to represent her constituents, to speak truth, The fact that doing so became remarkable says everything about where we are, but it also shows the power of example. One person refusing intimidation can inspire thousands, can shift the conversation, can remind us what leadership actually looks like. Pam Bondi thought she could silence a congresswoman with a televised attack. Instead, she gave that congresswoman a platform to speak truth to millions. That's the thing about intimidation. It only works when people submit. When they refuse, the intimidator loses power. Crockett refused. And in doing so, she reminded all of us, we have more power than we think. When we stand together, when we speak truth, when we refuse to accept that justice is negotiable. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, share it, because Crockett's message needs to reach beyond political bubbles. It needs to reach everyone who still believes in equal justice under law, and remember, no one is above the law. But that principle only holds if we defend it, if we demand it, if we refuse to accept double standards no matter which party benefits. Jasmine Crockett stood up. Now it's our turn. Until next time, stay informed, stay engaged, and above all, stay committed to the truth. Because as Crockett proved, one voice speaking truth can make all the difference.